Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm happy to be here. Finally.
You didn't take that long to schedule it. I don't know what you're saying finally for, but yeah, you were
No, everybody
fantastic.
wants to be on this podcast.
God bless you, sir. I appreciate you. Listen, there are a lot of things I want to talk to you about. Water is obviously a big one, but everybody has heard at this point that we have a water resolution. By the way, almost everybody I've spoken with has said that, hey, you got to talk to Scott Bedke about this. He was integral in making this happen. I want to hear about what the conversation was, because it's almost like the thing that strikes me about Idaho politics, and the more functions I see as I spend more time in it, it's like the idea of pragmatism and just reality. And look, we got a problem. How are we going to deal with this? That comes into sharp focus every single time, and more so every problem I hear about. So help me understand how you got everybody who wanted the water to agree.
Well, my wife always says that somebody will just ask you what time it is, and then you, Scott, feel like you're obligated to describe how to build a watch. And so I'll try to pick and choose what we say here. But, I mean, we live in the arid West. Yeah. And we don't have a lot of extra water here in Idaho, right. Yet our economy, a large part of our state economy, is dependent on agriculture, sure, and the ancillary industries around food production. And so when we have a water problem, that becomes a big deal. All right, so we live in the West, and we allocate the scarce resource called water through what is called the prior appropriation doctrine, sure, which in a phrase is first in time is first in right. And so if you have a senior water right, you're better off than someone that has a junior water right, because in the time of scarcity, the junior shuts off until the senior gets their water. But that's very disruptive. Prior appropriation is harsh. It's abrupt. It puts people out of business, et cetera. And so communities, but it's baked into the Idaho Constitution and all the statutory construct around our Constitution. And so communities, neighbors that are both senior and junior, have worked out ways to work with each other through the years. And it may be as simple as, hey, if I'm speaking from the perspective of senior, I don't want to put you, junior, out of business, but I also need my water. But there's some things that we could both do to make our community, our system better if we will just do it. And because you're junior and I'm senior, maybe most of the effort is going to have to be, on you, junior, because, keep in mind, we're just trying to create a way so that juniors can pump water out of priority.
If I may,
yeah,
it very much sounds like I have 3 boys, and it very much sounds like the engagement when there's a birthday party and somebody gets a new birthday present, and they're like, "Hey, this is mine. Like, I could play with this all day long and not give you a turn ever. But what I'm going to do, because I'm cool, is I'm going to work with you a little bit, but let's all acknowledge I could just walk away with this to my room and you'd never see me again."
You've got it nailed. If you're a parent, you live prior appropriation. I had this first. That was mine. Anyway, that is exactly what prior appropriation is, and we come by it fairly naturally.
Yeah, sure.
But in order to get along, the brothers in the birthday example have got to figure out a way to get along. Yeah. And so they're stuck with each other's brothers, and we could use all of our chits fighting over the new present, or we can take a longer view, and we're going to have to get along as brothers and community members. And we'll quit stretching that analogy, but that's kind of where it is with in the water world.
Sure.
So juniors come up with a list of things that they will do that will make the system better for everyone, and then the seniors agree that if they'll do the list, let's call it a mitigation plan, that if they'll complete and perform the mitigation plan, then they will enjoy safe harbor from a water call from the seniors, because we have dry years, we have wet years, we have long water years, short water years, et cetera. And so there's these huge swings that these mitigation plans attempt to smooth out so that we can have a community, so that we can have predictability year in, year out. And so I got asked to do this for the first time back in 2015, is we'd had this decades-long struggle, much along the lines that I've just described, because in Idaho, the river, and we're talking specifically the Snake River system here, is hydrologically dependent on the aquifer adjacent to the river. And the senior water right holders had the surface water rights on the river, and the juniors are the pumpers that came in later, usually in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and drilled wells. And we're tapping into what everyone, including the state, thought was an inexhaustible supply of water. Well, inexhaustible supplies don't exist anywhere anyway. So what started happening, but also the state of Idaho built policy around that concept that there's a lot of water. And so all policies were directed into bring more ground under cultivation and expand the ag economy and do that. The utilities, whether it was Idaho Power or the other utilities, the co-ops, they all wanted to sell power, and they were very disposed of running power lines out to pumps and doing all other things. And every light that anybody saw in this area certainly through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s was green lights, go do. And then during the 80s, we started thinking, whoa, we're starting to see some signs that this is maybe not an inexhaustible supply of water. And certainly in the 90s, that was the case. And so senior water right holders started going, whoa, we're not getting our water. We're going to put out a water call. And the first call, the first big call was the Musser call back in the 90s. But the courts kind of deferred. They didn't, they knew they would be very disruptive. It would put people out of business. So they kind of said, we don't have enough science to make hard rulings at this point. And so they kind of kicked the ball down the road. The next big call came in 2005, and this was from the Twin Falls Canal Company. And they're the oldest water right on the lower part of the Snake. Now, if you go up around Rexburg, Idaho Falls, the LDS colonists that went there in the 1870s and 80s, that is older water. But all of that is not connected back to Twin Falls. Twin Falls' right was perfected in 1908, and that was all of the water that wasn't used in the Upper Valley came back into the river, and that was where they made their water filing, and the state said, yes, we'll give it to you, and you now have a property right that we, the state, will defend. All right. Everything's going just fine.
Everything's going just fine. No problem.
No problems.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Twin Falls Canal Company, that's the company that Brian Olmsted was part of.
Correct. He was the director there. He was the chairman of the board. He was their main guy.
I had a fantastic conversation with him recently. Really, for anybody interested, his history of water and whatnot is
he understands
fantastic. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Okay. Well, and he was a main driver because he was the executive director, that's not the right title there at Twin Falls, but he was
part of the leadership.
Yeah, he was the guy
Great.
At Twin Falls back in 2015. Where I was first approached to help mediate this problem. So the court and the science got its act together, and they issued what they called methodology orders in 2015, which basically said we now have a way to calculate injury at the senior level, and juniors, if you cause injury, you've got to either pay up in the water that they need or mitigate that injury. And so 2015 was a dry year, and everything was coming to a head, and they said, and we're going to check in May, and we're going to check in July, and we're going to check in September, and if you juniors are not giving them the adequate water, then you're going to have to deliver it at the expense of your own water. You're going to shut off. Okay. And I'm hitting the very, very high points here. And so basically the parties got together, and the surface water guys, to their credit, said, hey, we don't want to put anybody out of business here, but we'll sit down. with the juniors, and the juniors, to their credit, were also recognizing that their wells were dropping, and that the aquifer was going down, and that they needed to balance the water budget. In other words, we're only going to take out what comes in. Now, as a side note, other states do not have that policy, and they manage their water as if it were an oil or gas reserve, and whoever has the longest straw and the most horsepower win. And that depletes the aquifer. Then there's nothing for the next generation. And that's counter to Idaho's basic philosophy, whether it's in forest management or water management, is that we don't want this generation to take from the next generation. That we view these resources as being sustainable, and that but this generation can only take its share, and so that there's that amount available to the next generation. So in forest, you only get to take the growth increment, and in water, you only get to take what comes in on average is what you can take out on average. And so that takes a lot of coordination. All right, so we're out of balance in 2015. So we create a list of things that the juniors could do, a mitigation plan that they all agreed to follow. Now, in hindsight, there were flaws in that mitigation plan, and they came to light, during the dry years of 2020, 2021, 2022 were pretty dry years, and we stress tested that system, and it didn't work. So rather than go back to the drawing board, they all took another turn in the court systems, and it's unfortunate, but that's what we did. And so 2023, we kind of put a Band-Aid on it, but this spring of 2024, we had all the mess that you recall well, and that the mitigation plan, people had walked away from it, and so that left the cold, harsh, unfeeling arms of prior appropriation, which would have been very disruptive to our state's economy, and specifically in the Magic Valley and in eastern Idaho.
So this 2024 is what leads us into, all of a sudden, there's this mass outcry from pump farmers saying, hey, our lands are getting dried up. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres are going to be spoiled. We've already planted all these things. This is where you had the, clips on social medias going all across the country, people that are completely unrelated to Idaho and Idaho agriculture, all of a sudden experts in water distribution and management. Of course, you have the people saying, hey, it's the cobalt miners. It's like, what? Okay, cobalt miners, fine. And this is where everybody essentially says, hey, we tried to work well together. This hasn't worked. The mitigation plans aren't working. Water call time.
Right. Yeah. Water call time. And that means a curtailment. And when you get to curtailment, then that's just the state's reaction to protecting property rights. The state issued property rights on all these water rights. But on the water right are several things where you're going to use the water. See, the state owns the molecules of the water. Sure. And under a certain framework, they will grant you a property right to use those molecules if you put it to beneficial use. And you're going to tell everybody where you're going to use it. And attached to that right is a priority date. So, first in time is better than second in time. And that's all baked into your water right, and then the state is duty bound to protect that property right, just like they protect all of your property rights. To protect the safety of your home and your property, etc. And so when you get to curtailment, that means that the system has kind of puked, and it's all broke down. And now we're going to just protect property rights. And again, like I described earlier, it's very disruptive. It's very hard on everybody. And to the state's credit this year, we went right up to the edge, and everybody looked over and they said, man, those look like rocks down there, and we don't want to jump. It's going to be a hard landing. And so we put a Band-Aid on the problem to get through 2024 with the commitment. And of course, the governor issued his executive order that asked for the parties to come together and ask Bedke and Raybould. So Jeff Raybould is the chairman of the Water Resource Board, and they asked us to co-facilitate, co-mediate this problem and get something that could be longer lasting if we took all summer long. And it did take all summer long. We only signed it here last week or so. And so we sat down with the players. And to begin with, everybody was lawyered up, and these meetings were hard. They were rancorous. Nobody had rolled their sleeves up in a problem-solving way yet. And so we diplomatically asked all of the lawyers to leave the room and for the future meetings, so we could facilitate this discussion farmer to farmer. Because the farmers understand each other. Yeah, their priority dates are different, but they're all farmers, and they're generational farmers, and they don't want to put each other out of business. But they're possessive of their water. And so it took a few meetings for the farmers to start talking about the principles that should be in the agreement going forward. We looked back to the 2015 agreement. We saw the things that weren't working, and all committed in principle of the things that we wanted baked into the next agreement, the 2024 agreement. It was only after we had this agreement in principle that we brought the lawyers back into the meetings so that we could capture this agreement in principle into a legal binding document that would be flexible and the ability to change if it needed to change, but it honored the prior appropriation doctrine, but at the same time, it gave all parties time to get this thing fixed. And so, in a nutshell, what they agreed to do was that they all were going to take approximately 12% less water out of the aquifer. And so then that immediately starts to balance the ins with the outs. So that was number one. But before, in the 2015 agreement, they lived and died together. The Eastern Snake Plain aquifers divided up into 9 groundwater districts, from Ashton clear to Hagerman. And so they allocated the burden aquifer wide. And so you had 9 entities, and if one of them didn't perform, then the math didn't work, and they were all they all were penalized. Think of a football practice. Yeah. You're in football practice, the tackle jumps offside, the whole team runs laps. And that maybe works in high school football, but it doesn't work very good out in real life with adults. And so everybody said, well, that's not fair. I did mine. I did what you ask of me, and now we're all being penalized. So that needed to change. Another thing is that we were able to do recharge. Well, that means sometimes there's a lot of water in the river, and if we put that back into the aquifer, then that should ameliorate the whole situation. But all recharge is not created equal. If the problem is the return flow between Blackfoot and Minidoka, putting recharging water in Gooding doesn't get water in the reach that you need the water.
Right, because you can put the water into the aquifer, but there's no guarantee exactly where it's going to come out.
Well, we know how it's going to come out because it's all modeled. And so, if you're going to do recharge for credit, it's got to be in a way that is hydrologically significant to the reach that is the problem. All right, so there was all agreement on that, and we were able to work that out. And but see, going back to the reduction of 12%, well, so that's a reduction off of a number, and so now what is left is everybody's allocation. And so that is divided out based on acres to the 9 groundwater districts. So now everybody has an allocation. And rather than dividing that year by year, because some years you want to grow potatoes, which take a lot of water, and other years you want to grow malt barley, which doesn't take as much water. And so just getting the same amount every year didn't make sense. So what we did was the farmers basically have a 4-year rotation, and they grow potatoes every 4th year. And maybe it's potatoes, grain, sugar beets, grain, and there's this rotation. And so we came up with this idea of averaging based on a 4-year allotment. So here's 4 years worth of water, And when it's gone, it's gone. And then that empowers the farmer to make all of the management decisions in the same manner that he's farming right now, because you have to rotate your crops. And again, one crop uses more water than the next crop. And so this 4-year allocation is integral. And so that allows for averaging. At the same time, I can increase my allotment if I do private recharge. If I do it in a place that is hydrologically significant, then that brings more water to the party, so to speak, and my allocation as a groundwater district can now go up. Net good thing for the farmers. And, so there's this whole concept of averaging that wasn't in the 2015 agreement. It was just year by year, and it was, and they all sunk or swam based on their collective actions. And you could make a case that it was unfair, and it did not work. When we stress tested that system in the dry years of 21, 22, it didn't work. All right. So the new system allows for this averaging. It puts a framework around private recharge for credit. And so not only are we conserving water in the aquifer, but we can, through strategic placement of water in the aquifer, increase our allocations. That makes it much more usable. I mean, you have a checking account, you have a savings account. If you've been putting money in if you're putting money in the savings account thinking that at some point you can shift it to your checking account, and then the bank says, no. Yeah. Then you cry foul. And that was similar, so the 2015, looking back, it had some real rudimentary problems to it. But everybody thought it was the cat's meow back then. Anyway, it wasn't. So we learned from our mistakes. 8 years of experience helped us create this new agreement that allowed for, again, an allocation. We stand on our own 2 feet and our own actions. We're not tied to other people's actions. We average. And we build a framework around recharge. Well, if we're going to do all of this and we're going to be stuck, have to live by an allocation, we're going to measure. And we're going to make sure that every gallon that moves is going to be measured. And the technology exists for us to have real-time data all the time. It takes investment in meters and all of those types of things, and telemetry to have those meters talk back to a dashboard someplace. But think how Idaho Power, for example, or the utilities, they don't send anybody out to read the meters, and you're not on your honor system on how much electricity you use. It is measured, and that the meter is smart, and it sends back to the home office the kilowatt usage, et cetera. And that technology can happen in the water world. But it can also be just as simple as going out and reading it. But the take-home message is that we're not that every gallon that moves out of the aquifer is going to be measured. And because you're never going to administer anything that you're not measuring. So those are basically the things that are in this new agreement. They agreed to quit fighting and to set up this other system that has a fighting chance of working. Now, I don't know where the bugaboos are going to be down the road, but I just know there's going to be some. So there's an ability for both parties to modify the plan as long as both of them choose. It can't be unilateral. They're stuck with each other. And so that's kind of an interesting point. This plan is hoped to last 12 years, but the plan is broken up into 3 4-year compliance periods. So if everything's working in the first 4 years, then it'll roll into the second 4 years. And if it's working at the end of that 8th year, then it'll go into the next 4-year block. And it allows for modifications along the way on stuff that we learn. And so it's at least going to last 4 years. Everybody has agreed to that. And that hopefully, if it works as like we think it will, then it'll roll into the next 4 years and the next 4 years. So these compliance periods are consistent with the crop rotation cycle and the 4-year water allocation. And I think we got a really good chance of making this work. Plus, everybody agreed to quit fighting, quit suing each other. And
whatever you did in those rooms to get them to stop fighting, you tell me, because my boys are just that they can't help it.
But the magic happens in your family when the boys realize they're stuck with each other, and that nobody's going to, mom and dad are going to be fair, and they're not going to choose one over the other, and they're going to have to get along. And that's when the magic happened also in these water negotiations. Is the first few meetings were hard, and then everybody started, hey, we're kind of stuck with each other. Like I was saying early, and I work a lot of political problems. I mean, I'm 24 years into politics here, 22 in the House and 2 as the lieutenant governor, and 10 of that was I was the Speaker of the House. And so that's not necessarily how we work out problems politically. But what was so beautiful, and I'll choose that word, about what happened this summer was that once everybody understood they were stuck with each other, then they started making the compromises necessary to get along. Now, nobody had to jettison their rights or their position on seniority or whatever, but they started to look a little bit to the horizon, and for the good of the order and for the good of the state and for the good of the ag economy. And, in the course of all of that, there were 4 words that were never mentioned as we did that. We never used the label of Republican, Democrat, liberal, or conservative. It just didn't come up because we had a common problem. And they just rolled up their sleeves and fixed it. Now, as long as we'll have that approach going forward, this thing will work. If we go into our corners and start labeling each other as, and it just will blow up. And, so as I look back and as I look forward to Idaho, we're the fastest growing state in the nation. But just because we are doesn't mean there's going to be 1 more gallon of water in the Snake River. Just because we are doesn't mean we're going to get 1 more lane mile of road. Just because we are doesn't mean there's going to be 1 more desk in the schools, etc. We've got these common problems. And once we realize that these problems are common to all of us, then we can roll up our sleeve and start solving these problems without all the labeling. But if we think there's an advantage to labeling and that we can lord it over, one side can lord it over the other side, then the system starts breaking down. And so, and people are people. We'll find reasons to disagree, but it was very cool watching it kind of unfold this summer, because people started listening to their better angels, and they, and I don't want to be Pollyanna here or melodramatic, but it did work. And I'm reminded of the letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And he said, it's no wonder we had all these problems, because we all are coming from Maine to the Carolinas or Georgia. We've got all of these different parochial issues. We all think we're infallible. And so he was asking them to, when it came time to sign the Constitution, to set aside or question their own infallibility and let it happen, or give it a chance to work. And then, of course, we created this republic, madam, if you can keep it. And that was his perspective, is that this is going to be a work in progress, the whole concept of the United States of America. And in a much smaller sense, and in another way, is this water agreement is going to be like that too. We can make it work if we choose to. And so I had these glimpses at times this summer of that very thing. And it made me optimistic. It made me proud to be an Idahoan. I was asked in one meeting here a week or so ago, and we were talking about the Constitution. It was with the American Legion up in Ketchum on Veterans Day. They asked me, are there still any people like the Founding Fathers left? And so I recounted my experience with the water deal. And I have to say, yeah, within their spheres of influence, there are statesmen. And there are people that can see a larger picture, and there are people that can see what and look out for the good of the order, if you will, and set aside their own parochial interests sometimes. Now, we can't do that for long. You can't give it away forever without without it, the bills coming due. But we can do better than we do sometimes. And so, again, I had a great experience. It was hard. We told everybody at the first, we have kind of this saying around the ranch is, this is going to be a full day, so you bring a sack lunch and a flashlight, because we're going to stay until we're done. And when everybody rolled up their sleeves, we were able to iron it out. And that is a good deal. That should be a breath of fresh air to every Idahoan, that if we want to, we can fix things. Now, if we choose to continue to cherry pick national issues and then find a place for them back in Idaho, and it's usually putting a square peg in a round hole because it just doesn't fit, because we've had decades of this pragmatic approach to governance here in Idaho. And I think it's partly the reason for Idaho's success, is people yearn for that. They want what we have been able to take for granted here. And so they're moving here, and we can't let all of this new growth change who we are. Who wants to wake up 10 years from now and wonder where their Idaho went? Not one of us. Now, my Idaho and the stereotype of my Idaho is different than yours, but there's some commonality in what we think Idaho should be. Free, to live and to prosper under our own ingenuity, to be given opportunity, to have, a safe community. All of the things that we kind of take for granted are here. And that was all reinforced to me this summer. And I'll quit repeating that, but it was a very good experience. And so I'm thinking, to the extent that we in leadership positions can use the principles that we know work. Successful families employ this all the time. Successful businesses employ these principles all the time. And so now I can't fix stuff in Washington, D.C., but I can fix stuff in my family. And if we have strong families, we have strong communities. And if we have strong communities, we have a strong state. And Idaho's been really good at that process through the years. And now we've been discovered, and we don't get to go back. And so we've got to fall back on these principles that have made Idaho the best place to live, to work, and to raise a family as we go forward. And that is what keeps me going, and anxious, and can't wait to hit the new day. And where am I going to be in Idaho? Because if you know where to look, and we all position ourselves as being this or being that, but underneath all of that is this basic goodness that I've described, and it's kind of, it makes me optimistic for a future.
I have heard many breakdowns of how we have arrived, much briefer than that, but different little nuggets about how we arrived at this. What you have articulated is, one, the most, fantastic explanation of self-governance and pragmatism that, I came from a place that was very much centered on a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And I was born there. I was raised there. That's where my family was. That's where my life was. I didn't choose to be born there. That's just where I lived. And I became very frustrated as I became an adult and started observing problems in my area. I was like, well, why can't we fix this? It's like, no, you can't do that. Because this one perfect example, I have a friend that's an old Berkeley landlord, and he, the People's Republic of Berkeley. And he would tell me, he was like, listen, you have to realize the sentiment in this area, because I went to school in Berkeley and he owned real estate. He's like, the sentiment in this area is, if there's any policy that's good for a landlord, it's decidedly bad for tenants. And he said, that's just not true. But what has happened, because that's a sentiment of the area and that's reinforced by city council and other elected officials, because that's the sentiment, you have this grave amount of dysfunction. You had landlords at the peak of rent control. You had landlords that, were they were very good at there would be a fire in an apartment building that burned to the ground, and there were bulldozers there by noon cleaning everything up before the insurance company was even alerted. And these are buildings that were in good repair. Nobody was killed, amazingly. All of a sudden, the whole thing burns down, and then boom, because quite literally just the cost of insurance on the building was greater than the rent that was being collected out of the property. And, nationally, you see examples of things like that. But that's the world that I came from.
Well, when you're in a zero-sum game world, as opposed to an expanding universe view,
yes,
then there are these perverse incentives that become baked into the process, and anybody that can pan back and look at it, declares it to be nonsensical.
Right.
But the status quo has so much inertia with it that it's hard to change it. And
it just, to that point, it destroys not just the functionality of municipalities, but it destroys the functionality of communities. And even I remember towards the end of my time there, the friendships that I lost over just saying, hey, wait, what's the solution? And they'd be like, anything but that. It's like, what do you mean anything but, like, what if that's an okay solution? They're like, nope, doesn't matter, can't do it, can't even give up an inch. It's like, what are you talking about? You're not interested in actually engaging in pragmatic living. You're interested in holding up your ideology at all expense.
Landlords, by definition, need tenants. And tenants, by definition, need landlords. And they have got to create this working arrangement that benefits both of them. And like I say, if you put your finger on the scale on the one side or the other, you create a system that becomes nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. Nobody, but that's the way it is. And so just go with it. And hopefully you get enough, you get yours, and everybody else be damned. That is not a good way to live together. You tolerate each other rather than having this sense of community. Now, I don't know why Idaho, and it's not always good here. And we're still talking, we still have people here that tend to try to find reasons to not get along sometimes. But the way Idaho developed and was settled, I think it took a lot of hard work. So people didn't have enough time. Once they got their basic needs met, they didn't have a lot of time to fight.
Right.
And then so we developed a state that is, hey, just give us an opportunity. Government, get out of our way. We'll do it ourselves. We'll help our neighbors where we can. And I'm from Oakley. That, and that not that everything is always perfect in that small town, but there is this sense of community. There is this sense of the Magic Valley. But when I travel to eastern Idaho, I've run into that same sense of community. You find it here in the Treasure Valley, certainly in central Idaho and north or southeastern Idaho. We have these very strong communities, and I think that is our ace in the hole here, is that we can draw on the things that have made these communities successful for literally decades, if not hundreds of years, and apply them at the state legislature. Let's start there. And rather than one-upping each other of who can be the most this or the most that or the least this or the least that, is let's start solving problems together. Let's bring this shared experience from all across the state here and try something that might work.
When you're talking about the water situation with somebody who has their birthday present and they do not have to share it,
right?
What was the ultimate thing that drew them to the table? Because if you, piss somebody off enough and you stick in their eye and they're like, hey, this is mine. I don't care about you. I don't need to care about you.
Mm-hmm.
You're just a dude down the road. The idea that people would voluntarily be like, all right, look, I could do this, but I'm not going to. And I will, in fact, commit myself to these things with you. We're not related. I don't owe you money. You're not married to my sister. I don't have to do this, but I'm going to do this because blank. What's that blank?
Well, that blank could be several things. Number one, when we got to that approach, I'm senior and I'm not playing.
Sure.
Okay. And I said, okay, well, I think that was probably, that sounds like a senior water right holders meeting in Arizona, in the Phoenix, in the Paradise Valley there, in 1962, is that that was an agricultural area, and they were senior, and they didn't have to worry about conserving water. They were senior. Everybody else that was moving in, certainly during the 70s, and that huge expansion that has happened in those counties around Phoenix, they are not ag communities any longer, and so they were not. So being senior forever, forever is a long time, and so back to the birthday present analogy, the new is going to wear off of that toy, and so the relationships that we create as we're protecting that toy or sharing that toy are the ones that will, because a year from now nobody's going to even remember what the toy was, but they're going to remember how they got along. And so I think that was part of it, is that yeah, they were senior and they were in the catbird seat, but they also understood that that things change. There's a saying, it's a very long road that does not have a turn in it. In fact, there's no road that doesn't have a turn. Things are not going to stay the way they are forever. And in fact, so the eastern part, if you go back into some of the discussions that happened in May and June, is fine. We'll just take this issue to the legislature. We'll just legislate a solution here. Now, what would have happened there is that the Magic Valley delegation would have come to Boise this January, and the Eastern Idaho delegation would have come to Boise in January, and they would have canceled each other out. And then the Treasure Valley delegation and the North Idaho delegation would have been the ones that would make the decision for the Magic Valley and Eastern Idaho. And I, with all due respect to the delegations in Treasure Valley and North Idaho, they don't know what we're talking about. And so bringing outsiders in to make the decisions that are going to be life or death economically for us is folly. And I was taught this point once in spades. In real life, I'm a cattle rancher, and I was very active in the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Idaho Cattle Association, etc. And we had a difference of opinion back in the 90s about pending federal grazing legislation. And the Idaho Cattle Association had one position, but the Owyhee County cattlemen had another, and we didn't reconcile those positions back in Idaho. We went to Washington, D.C. with two positions. And then Senator Craig called both of us in his office and said, all expletives deleted, never come back here to Washington, D.C. and make me choose between my friends. We've got enough problems back here in D.C. without having two positions from Idaho that you're going to make us choose on. We're ill prepared to do that. Now, Senator Craig could have done it, but because he, was raised on a ranch in Midvale, but he basically said, never do it again. Don't come back here until you have one position, because it's hard enough to get all of these states to get the 51 votes that he needed. Actually, he needed cloture, so he needed 60 votes in the Senate. And Idaho, who is a main player, came back with a divided position. Well, you can see exactly what would have happened. That you play that out on a water deal is then we're going to make people, then it's a beauty contest, and the votes from the Treasure Valley, the votes from Northern Idaho, fix it, but it may not be how it ought to be fixed. And so So when they got that way, this is mine and I can play with it as long as I want. And if I don't want to play with it, and I don't say, and I say you can't play with it, even though I'm not playing with it, then that sticks. Well, that's a very fleeting position. You can't hold that position forever, and they recognize that. So it wasn't some, hearing a higher reasoning, although I think that played into it. But it was this pragmatism that said, hey, my good position today may not be that good tomorrow. And if in the public's eye I'm seen as being unfair, then the body politic will over time correct that. And so I think that it was more of the political advice that they were given by, not just me, but others, that they said, I think we can work with these, because they only need enough water to do their crops. And as long as they get that, then they're golden. And then letting everybody else, do the same thing is kind of a, when you realize that, if I may, another quick example.
Please.
In my community, there was a big funeral that came to town, and these were from people that were outside of the community but had started in Oakley and wanted to be buried there. So there was a lot of family and a lot of kids that came to this funeral. And as an act of service, then we set up a nursery so that the kids could come to the nursery and the adults could go to the funeral. And in this building in Oakley, it's an LDS building, and there are 3 wards that meet there. And so there are 3 sets of toys in the nursery. And so we had the keys to all 3 closets. We opened all 3 closets, and there were these buckets of toys or baskets of toys, and we scattered them. And so we put one pile there and one in the middle and one at the end, and there were 25 kids that needed to be in nursery. And so what happened was one kid went to the one pile and sat down on the floor with his legs and arms extended and just tried to protect that pile of toys. Well, every other kid in the room, even though there were 2 perfectly good pile of toys, when they saw him not letting anybody play with those toys, they all just stood by that pile and cried. And he didn't have enough time to play with the toys because he was protecting the toys, and everybody else wanted those toys. And so, but when adults realize that, hey, there's enough toys for everybody, and I can just go play with mine, I can play with one at a time, and let everybody else play. This maybe is a stupid analogy, but it comes to mind as I watch adults interact. Is sometimes we learn that these behaviors that we see repeated as adults, we see in the early years, and I saw it there as I watched those kids fight over the toys.
Well, I hope they worked it out.
But that was what was so good about it, is that they rose above that natural tendency, sure. And so that gives me hope.
You mentioned a forethought for future generations, and this is something that I haven't heard you express that regarding water before. You and I have never chatted before, but I do have 2 younger sisters that go to a high school near here, and they did see you come and talk about I believe it's a launch program to help encourage economic development, skill development, and prosperity for people trying to stay in Idaho as they're graduating high school and trying to start their lives. This is something that Governor Little spoke about, in that people in the state of Idaho recognize that their children have limited capacity to thrive economically in this state, or they have better opportunities elsewhere. Right. What can be done going forward? Because the launch program was, again, I know a lot of people were in favor of it. Some people were not, for whatever principled reasons. But it appears to be trying to address a problem. Now, whether or not it was 100% successful addressing that problem, the problem maintains, which is, how do we create enough economic opportunity for our coming generations to keep the talent here, to not have a brain drain and a talent drain in the state of Idaho, so that we raise good people. They're capable, they're intelligent, and then they disappear once they're ready to give back.
Right. Well, launch was launched against this backdrop. Is we had approximately 36, 37, 8% of our graduating high school seniors that would go into any organized program, whether it be a university, college, or whatever. only 35%. The other 65, or let's say it was 40, but the other 60 went into the job market, and they were largely unskilled. And so they were then had to learn on the job or whatever. And but at the same time, Idaho has scholarship programs that are directed to the kids that are headed to colleges and universities, the ones that are going to be, businessmen or doctors, lawyers, engineers, etc. We'll help those kids. But the kid that wanted to go to a trade school or become a plumber or a carpenter or a welder or the list is long. The things that really make our economy work is the blue-collar jobs, the people that are working with their hands. There's zero help for them.
And if I may, just real fast, even the absence of a scholarship, I believe a BSU student 1 year draws, I think, $25,000 of state funding just to operate. And that's even, they're paying tuition, fine, but that doesn't mean the tuition covers everything. The state has to pony up, again, roughly $25,000. That's in the absence of a scholarship.
Yes.
And that's somebody who could be like a dum-dum like me who studies rhetoric, or philosophy or something.
Well, and so these are launches directed to the first 2 years of the out of high school. Sure. So any kid that graduates or high school in Idaho and that is going into a program that can lead to a quote in-demand career. And that's a designation that the Department of Labor used. We kind of co-opted that, and that's kind of part of the problem. But by and large, it's any job in the medical field. It's a teacher. It's all of the trades program, whether it's truck driving or airplane mechanics or diesel mechanics. All of those things are what we need as a state. And so, Idaho, as it's being discovered, you go back 3 or 4 years, we were running billion-dollar surpluses on a $5 or $6 billion budget. That is unheard of. This lean, mean machine that we had created as Idaho was a low-cost producer. And so when we had all of this new economic activity that happened because of all the people that moved in, then we set a budget here, and the taxpayers sent in that amount of money. And this ended up being like $1 billion for a couple of years in a row. And so what did we do as policymakers? We took that money and, first of all, we lowered taxes. But second, we took those surpluses and invested them back into the state of Idaho, into our roads and bridges and our schools and those types of water systems. But we also made a conscious effort to invest back into Idaho citizens, not only just by lowering their taxes, but giving their kids the opportunity to better themselves, to get a good paying job. Now, I speak to a lot of groups across the state, and it doesn't matter what persuasion they are, but every parent and every grandparent in those audiences know that their kids are going to be better off with a better job than a higher paying job or a less paying job, and the difference is usually training. And life is going to be, they all know that life is going to be hard enough, but it's going to be a little bit easier if you got a good job. Yeah. And so this ability to offer a scholarship to go, a lot of kids, way more than half, don't see themselves wanting to go to a university setting. And so but they do see themselves wanting to work with their hands or work in industry. And the economy needs that desperately. And so this was a way to kind of jumpstart that in the launch. Now, is it perfect? No. Will they work? Will they tweak on it? I hope that they do. I hope that they don't throw it out. But I hope that we'll fix that, because underneath that is this ability, this investment back into our state. So in hard infrastructure, but also the soft infrastructure that makes Idaho work. And that rising tide will make our state better.
I have a friend. He actually officiated my wedding. He was my high school swim coach, became a great mentor and a guide of mine, and then officiated my wedding. And where I grew up in Northern California, he told me, he said, look, when I was a kid, he was about 20 years younger than I am. He's like, when I was a kid, my dad ran cattle all over these hills. And I lived in the foothills of Mount Diablo, which is in the East Bay. And they're beautiful hills. I mean, just absolutely gorgeous area, obviously. And they used to run kind of like, what, really? He said, yeah. And I would go running on Mount Diablo or cycling, and you could see all these old vestiges of cattle operations, right? Be they, barbed wire fences or old barns that were falling down, things of that nature. But that industry disappeared there for a number of reasons. But it was one of those things where like, I could not imagine somebody, driving cattle over this place. And like, yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. What do we do to help the cattle industry maintain success here? Because it's not unthinkable to have international suppliers like New Zealand and Australia have done to the sheep industry and lamb industry. It's not unthinkable that outside suppliers, either in the country or internationally, could hamper or damage our cattle industry. It's also not unthinkable that our own growth and distribution of citizens could hamper that. Nor is it unthinkable to have something like the Lava Ridge project that, where the federal government comes in and takes over 200,000 acres of land right now that's used for ranching and whatnot. So what can be done to make sure we can maintain this industry that has such a great impact on the state?
Well, several things, and that's a very broad question. Number one, we're frustrated over Lava Ridge because the state of Idaho, has no say in it. It's all on federal land. 2/3 of Idaho is federally managed. So the local bureaucrat has more to say about what's going to happen on land in Idaho, on federal land in Idaho, than the governor does. Now, we have our ways, and we can lean in, and we can find pinch points. But, so if we're ranching in Idaho, then like we do, and I'm a 4th-generation cattle rancher, and we ranch on your land. So we ranch on the public land. And so that's basically how I got into politics to begin with, because you can imagine the difference between the land management policies under, let's say a Trump administration, and the land management policies under a Biden administration, or Clinton and Bush or Obama. And, so there's this whipsaw effect on land management policies. So, but the bottom line is that no never means no for more than 4 years. Yes never means yes for more than 4 years. And so there's always going to be this political component to ranching in the West. And so that's, and so it's important to me that there's a 5th generation and a 6th generation. And so by necessity, we have to be involved in national politics, at least with regard to land management. And that was me. And I did that a lot. But I testified in Congress in Washington, D.C. several times before I ever stepped foot into a committee in Boise, because that's where the decisions were made, was on the Potomac, and not in back in back in Idaho. So there's that. So land management policies are critical, and but land management policies are basically, if I'm ranching on your land, ultimately I'm going to do that with your tacit approval. And so if I were asking Idaho citizens, so I always need to be ready to explain why your interests on the public land in Idaho are better met by having a family rancher out there than any of the other uses. And there's enough room for all of us, frankly, out there. And so I, as the rancher, have the responsibility to always be able to explain that to you in a way that, so you can go, well, the amenities that I've come to expect from public land in Idaho are being met. And it doesn't matter whether I'm speaking to you as an Idaho citizen or a citizen from New Jersey or Minnesota or Florida or whatever. They all think they own a little piece of the public land in the West. And so we, as public land users in the West, whether we like it or not, whether that's a great system or a flawed system, that's a discussion for another day. The 10th Amendment would just, I would say that the West didn't come into the Union on equal footing as the eastern states did. There's no public land in any of the states to the east of us.
Like Rhode Island doesn't have public land?
No. Well, they may have state land, but they don't have federal land. They just have the federal land that's carved out for arsenals, dockyards, and post offices.
I had no idea.
Yeah, Texas came in as a sovereign nation. All of the land there is private, and then there's state reserves in there. Ditto Nebraska, Iowa, Indiana. Anyway, so it's a whole nother story. But my point is I may like that, I may not like that, but I'm stuck with it. So I have always got to be able to explain to the citizens in the United States why their expectations of public land in specifically Idaho are being met by having our family out there. So I got to be able to be conversant on range management and genetics and rotational grazing systems, etc., and wildlife biology and all like that. I've got to be able to talk intelligently on those subjects, and that got me into politics in a roundabout way. And so here I am. And so back to your question of what can we do for ranchers in Idaho is, number one, eat beef. Because
I'm doing my part.
So
I'm doing my part.
If we're not moving the product, then that's going to be a problem. And but if we're going to ranch in Idaho, these cattle, 80% of the cattle in Idaho are going to spend some time of their life on federal land, and that's got to be okay. And so there's always this push-pull on, whether it's at Lava Ridge, they're saying, there in the EIS, the Environmental Impact Study, and the NEPA process, anyway, there was not even where they present the alternatives. There usually is a no action alternative, and in this one there was not. Not having windmills was not one of the options. It was just how many, and so they were shoving that down our throats. And so every constitutional office holder, every senator, every congressman, every locally elected official came out in opposition to Lava Ridge, but that hasn't stopped them yet. Now, hopefully under the Trump administration, it'll come down from the top, from the Department of Interior or whatever, or our well-positioned Congressman Simpson at appropriations can block the funding. But it was never a direct thing of Idaho or the federal government having to sit down at the table and work it out with Idaho. They said, we don't have to, and we're not going to. Or we'll give it lip service and we don't have to. So if we let these other federal issues devolve into the issue like Lava Ridge has turned into, then the cattle ranchers in Idaho are going to be the net losers of that, because we need to get by every year and have access to that grass that we turn into the delicious steak that you love to grill. And so that's how we keep ranching in Idaho, is that we've got to be aware of federal land management policies, and we got to be okay with them as citizens, and we've got to keep the product moving through the supply chain. That's code for buy beef, and then that's all I need. I don't need you to come in and micromanage my business or whatever. If I'm a good operator, then I prosper. If I'm a bad operator, then I go out of business. Let the invisible hand pick the winners and losers. Let's not pick them by fiat, by policy decision.
Beautiful, beautiful explanation, by the way. And again, I will say I'm doing my part. I am an autopendant carnivore, and I love me some good. Man, I got my wife this smash burger press, and we get McIntyre Farms. We get Oregon ground beef blend, just because I really like that, like savory.
Oregon?
Oh yeah, so they throw like liver and stuff in it.
Oh, Oregon.
Oregon, yeah, not Oregon.
I thought
forget Oregon.
I gotta say, we can find that in Idaho.
No, it's great. Yeah, I think they're in Caldwell, but and then we do the smash burger with like the wax paper and smash it all nice and thin. And my boys, like, we will cook 4 We'll cook like 4 to 5 pounds of it. We'll make something like 20 patties, and we will have like 3 left at the end of dinner. They're doing double doubles. Like there's nothing stopping them.
It's watching teenage boys eat is a beautiful thing.
Dude, they're not even teenagers.
Oh, really?
My
Well,
oldest is 12.
Brace yourself,
12?
my friend.
I already have 3 refrigerators. I'm braced, right? I'm thoroughly prepared.
And I know where I can hook you up with some beef if you ever need it.
Hey, I appreciate that, because I will take all of it. One last question, because again, I know there's a working day, and you've been so generous with your time. And this is something that is really, really important for me to understand. As I understand more of what the state is and what the state is not, and that is, I recognize, going to be a lifelong pursuit of mine. I am left with a question as somebody who hasn't even been here for 3 years yet. It's like, what is my place here? How can I help Idaho? I did not move to this state looking for a handout. I did not move to this state looking for something in return. I moved to this state leaving the only thing I had ever done in my adult life, which was education, and I left that all behind. And for the first year I was here, I had a very dark period where I didn't know where I had value to offer my community. And I had never, from the week I graduated college, I knew exactly what I was like. See that kid? Make that kid smarter. Done. And I want to know how I can help. What can I do for Idaho as somebody who has moved here? I'm working on understanding it, but I want to help.
Well, I think that you're on the exact right path. You're trying to understand why you chose Idaho. Because there were these intangibles, there were these vague messages that Idaho sent to you that made you go, well, I'm assuming I'll give it a try. And I think that the more research you do, the more your decision is going to be reinforced. This is a good place because you're going to sink or swim based on your own acumen, but you're going to be doing that with others within a community that, there's a live and let live mentality. There's I'm going to mind my business, you mind yours, and we're going to get along. There's a famous, well, I think it's famous, and there's a poem by Robert Frost, and it's called Mending Fence, or Mending Wall, actually. And there's a stanza in that I'll bet you know. And it talks about these 2 New England farmers, old farmer, young farmer. They meet on a designated day in the spring every year, and they walk that wall, that stone wall. And they muse what happens in the winter. There's always stones that fall off, and they put them back up, and they walk this fence and repair it. And as they do that, the young farmer says, you don't have any livestock. I don't have any livestock, and we got this fence, and why do we need the fence? And the old farmer said to the young farmer, the stanza that is, he says, because good fences make good neighbors. And what he meant to say, as long as we know where my property rights stop and where your property rights start, if we honor that line, we're always going to get along. And Idahoans have been really good about honoring that line. We stay on our side of the fence. If you invite us over, we're there in 2 seconds, and we'll bring potluck. But we honor that line of property rights and that privacy that extends past property. And and I know there's probably notable exceptions to that, but I think part of our success has been this honoring of that line. And so, and you're, the Idaho that you were drawn to, it was like you looking at it through a keyhole, and you got some perspective, and then you looked at it through another keyhole. And so you're able to triangulate what Idaho was or what it wasn't, and you liked it enough to come. And now you have the whole perspective here, and it's going to take some time to grow appreciation for it. So be patient as you do that, because you're going to find all sorts here, just like everywhere else. But we got the underlying foundational blocks here that is kind of a live and let live. You honor your side. We lived here together, but I have stuff that I want protected. You have stuff that you want protected. So let's honor that line. and we're going to get along. And then we build on that. And we may be members of of community auxiliaries and at the school or at the church or whatever. But Idaho is a good place to live because of this interaction that happens between the people, and we've created this system where that seems to thrive. Now, again, I'm speaking in absolutes and whatnot, and there's exceptions to every one of these rules. And my perfect view is not your perfect view, but we're going to have to honor that we've got different views, and that's okay. And I think that that's been a lot, that attributes to our success here. Now, I'm not going to be the keeper of Idaho's culture going forward. You are not going to do it forever, but we all are. And I think that as long as we have some of these basic tenets that we all agreed to, Idaho is going to be a great place to live for a long time. But we're going to honor lines and honor boundaries. And when we do that, we all get along. Robert Frost, Mending Wall. It's a good musing of, I read a lot, and I looked up because everybody says, well, good fences make good neighbors. And how that applies in the water world is if we're sucking out of a common aquifer, and it's a big sponge, and I draw water out of right here in the sponge, then that's going to have a hydrological effect to this vacuum that I'm going to create here. And so that's going to affect the other people that have wells. And if we're going to get along in this aquifer, we're going to have to honor, but it's hard to see where my property rights stop and yours start in a big sponge called an aquifer. And so we do that through modeling and multiple linear regression and all of these complicated ways so that we can predict cause A has effect B. And that's all to the end of knowing where one's property rights stop and the next one start. And but if you go to your home state or where the state you left, their policy in the Central Valley is to whoever has the longest draw and the most horsepower wins. And as a consequence, the communal aquifer there has dropped. Literally, the whole valley has dropped in elevation because it's just settled, and so now they're crisis managing. Same in Texas, same in New Mexico, but Idaho does it a little differently, and we have this sustainability thing. Now everybody's trying to get there now, but the good news is that we've got a lot to work with here. And, even after all of the dry years and everything, on average, there's about 1 million acre feet that leaves the state every year because it came at the wrong time, at the wrong place. So if we just allocate that water, put it where we do need it, it's going to take some investment. Then so we've got things that we can work with to ameliorate our water problem here. And so,
hey man, I have been so pleased to be here, and then seeing the state show up, all members like they did to solve this problem, and come to a functional resolution. Man, talk about something to reinforce my move here. It gives me faith that this may be one of the last functional bastions of clear conservative governance in the United States,
and it will remain so if, as Benjamin Franklin told Mrs. Powell on the sidewalk of Philadelphia, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And so, tag, we're it. we're the ones.
Popcorn Scott.
That's right. We are the ones that are going to have to keep this thing, and it's going to take effort, and it's going to be more than just yielding to the lowest common denominator.
Well, Lieutenant Governor, I greatly appreciate the time you took today to drive out here and have this conversation, explain all of these things. I will take you up on your beef offer because whoever's got good beef here, I want to meet that guy.
Okay.
let's do this again, please. I know that the issues and conversation about Idaho are vast and numerous, and I'm here for all of it because, again, every time I have a conversation, it's like, wow, man, I have 4 more questions.
Well, and write them down, and I will come. I enjoy this interaction. Political management by bumper sticker doesn't work. We got to have dialogue.
Right.
And, it was once, and, one guy once said to me, having a conversation with you, Bedke, is a lot like listening. And I hear that, and I don't want to be that guy, but I am very passionate about our state and the good things that we have here. And so this is my roundabout way of saying, you call, I'll come.
I appreciate that. I don't know that there are a lot of things that people would say you and I have in common right out of the blocks, but I think that comment on conversation with you is probably one that people think of me. So I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for coming. We'll do it again.
You're welcome.